Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you this week in Brilon, in the Sauerland, which is home of my in-laws, passing through town this week. Joining me, as always, this week is FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor, Adam Tooze, this week in Amsterdam. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, this week we will be talking about the Nobel Prize winners of economics. The data point there is 1.2, as in $1.2 million. That is the amount of money that the winners of the Nobel Prize for economics split among themselves.
The prize goes to
the winners this year are Joel Mokyr
for having identified the prerequisites for sustained growth,
Philippe Aghion and Peter Howitt.
To Philippe Aghion and Peter Howitt for the theory of sustained growth through creative destruction.
We've been doing this podcast for several years, and I think we've covered the Nobel Prize winners of economics every year we've done the podcast. Listeners can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure that's the case. So yeah, we didn't want to leave this year uncommented on. And so, to dig in with, I thought I'd start by asking about Joel Mokyr, Adam, partly because he belongs to a subfield of economics, namely economic history, that you are also a practitioner of, Adam. And I'm curious what we can say about the status of economic history in the field of economics. Is this a recognition by the Nobel Committee that in some way is overdue for economic history? Most of the winners of the prize seem to be traditional sort of quantitative economists. So is this a sort of compensation in some ways by recognizing economic history specifically in this way?
Well, he isn't the first economic historian to win, so that honor goes to Robert Fogel and Douglas North. North had a particularly sophisticated and interesting intellectual pedigree, which went back to Marxism and then made him into, one of the great thinkers of what's called the new institutionalism. And Fogel was really a pioneer of quantitative economic history in its early days, so what was called cliometrics, so historical quantification. You could even say that Acemoglu and Robinson, who won last year, right, were deeply historical thinkers. I mean, rather traditional Whiggish historical thinkers, which turns out to be a common denominator, because I would say Joel Mokyr belongs in that group as well. That's the sort of history that the Nobel Prize seems to like. I wouldn't say that that's actually typical of where economic history currently places within economics, which is more prominent than it was, when I was coming up in the 80s and the early 90s. Economic history of a quantitative theoretical type, informed by both economic theory and serious econometrics, is now quite strongly presented in mainstream economics journals. This is really something, there's an interesting quantitative study of this, which shows a very considerable break in the 2000s. One of the things this has got to do with is that from the 1990s, and certainly with ever more force in the 2000s, development economics, growth economics, really began to revive its interest in economic history. And that's what I think this prize is also sort of gesturing towards. Not that you would call Aghion or Howitt particularly historically interested, though they engage with the real world. But the combination of the two, placing Mokyr alongside them, I think is gesturing from the prize committee towards this link up. This is something that's happening within economics. I mean, Ben Bernanke, after all, a lot of his work is historical too. Goldin, who we also spoke about when she won, very much a historical thinker of the development of American labor markets from a gender point of view. All of this is happening in economics. There's also a reappropriation of the economic within history, especially after the 2008 financial crisis, under the label of the new history of capitalism, which is very prominent in the US and very much centered, because it converges with Black Lives Matter and so on, around questions of slavery and the history of racial inequality in the United States. Very different camp, again, from what's going on within economics in terms of economic history, which is essentially time series problems, big problems and questions of economic growth, explored in historical dimensions or historical data. And I would say also very different from what somebody like Joel Mokyr does, which is a much more familiar type, really kind of quite classical type of narrative economic history.
So one of Mokyr's most well-known historical investigations is of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, or starting in Britain. And I'm curious, if we were to take that as an example, what his historical findings really brought forth. I mean, how did his work upend previous understandings of the Industrial Revolution? I mean, what was the inherited understanding to begin with that he was addressing and upending in that way?
I mean, I think really it's no slight to Mokyr to say that he's worked on the Industrial Revolution for his entire long career. And I don't see him really as somebody who's upending things, or rather I think he would probably think, or some people think of him as putting things back on their feet. I mean, he's not a transformative radical thinker, rather the opposite. I mean, he's a neoconservative, not to say reactionary thinker, to be honest, of the problems that he addresses. Because one of the impacts of economists entering the economic history domain was, in fact, that they undid the classic conception of the Industrial Revolution, this sudden, spurt of growth driven by gadgets that began to diffuse across the British economy from the 18th century. The whole point of economists engaging with 18th and 19th century European economic history was to do two things: A, to smooth out the growth curve by submerging industry within GDP aggregates, which made for a much more gradual and slow growth, and B, watering down the differences between Britain and obvious comparators like France, and then in the more current generation, also revising understandings of the difference between Britain and Western Europe and China, for instance. Mokyr will have none of that. I mean, he's a classic reassertion of the centrality of the British Industrial Revolution to the entire story, which he describes as such. And then to kind of compound this, he focuses on ideas rather than on knowledge, rather than on objective material forces, which have been the center of much recent conversation about the ratio of capital to labor, natural factors, the endowments of resource and so on, and then imperialism, none of that. And then on the cultural side, on the side of this revolution in knowledge, he asserts an absolutely straightforward classical understanding of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Again, deeply out of fashion in the history of science and cultural history circles. And I mean, it's really it's a neoconservative project of reasserting the centrality of these two interlocking great breaks. What he brings to the party is a kind of a new analytic of what it is that made that moment special. And this is where the hard work begins, which is to argue that what we really have to understand is not that there was growth or that there was technological innovation, because this had happened before in history, but that from the 18th century in Britain, it becomes a self-sustaining mechanism. And the way he explains this involves basically a series of dualisms, where you distinguish different types of knowledge: propositional knowledge, which is more theoretical, epistemic rules about how you know things, and prescriptive knowledge, which is techne in the Greek sense, that's art, skill, craft, and so on. And the key for Mokyr is that these become productively entangled with each other in Britain in the 18th century, so that if you tinker with something and it works, you might actually have a chance of understanding why it works, because your propositional knowledge will augment your prescriptive knowledge. And then with your physical theory, you might then be able to go back to your proto-steam engine and make it work better, because you maybe have some understanding of thermodynamics. And then the next question is, well, how could this have happened in Britain at this moment? And so then he requires a new history of the British Enlightenment, which is a story of this combination between general knowledge and more specific knowledge, which allows macro inventions to harness to micro inventions. And then you need to characterize the Enlightenment, and you end up with a story about really, again, a super classical story, which is a story about skepticism and the willingness to overthrow tradition and the willingness to, believe in progress, which is then anchored even more fundamentally in a story about what makes Europe different from China, where an awful lot of inventing was going on, which comes down to stories about how Europe was not a single monolithic empire, that classic narrative about how the hegemony of a single empire in China stifled innovation, and then a story about the Republic of Letters, a kind of public sphere kind of argument. I mean, it's really, like I say, it's not a knock necessarily. I mean, there's an element of skepticism in my voice. I'm kind of puzzled by the conservative taste of the Nobel Prize Committee. Maybe one shouldn't be. But I mean, that's the kind of story this tells. It goes very well with the Acemoglu and Robinson Prize from last year. I mean, Acemoglu is a flat-out brilliant theoretical economist, a great modeler, like different, he's in the Aghion camp. But the historical narrative that him and Robinson produce is the Whiggish equivalent of this, but centered on political institutions. So they kind of give them back-to-back prizes to Whig views of history.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you use the term classical view, and in some sense, it sounds like the classical view is classical in that it predates the economical view, like the modern economist's view to begin with. I mean, it's sort of like drawing on something that's like before the modern science of economics, in the sense that it's
got hold of this history. Yeah, I mean, it's really like early 20th century accounts. I mean, this is a little unfair because Mokyr is a smart guy and he's worked his way through the literature and he's worked this argument out, and it's painstaking. But the general story is, ironically, one that harks back to a period before economists really began to think hard about the 18th and 19th century as periods of what they call modern economic growth. So it's a very fascinating choice.
So then what do Mokyr's findings suggest going forward? Because the Nobel Prize is inherently a prize about economic policy. So I mean, what would his historical findings suggest about growth and innovation going forward?
Well, I mean, on the one level, it's predictable. I mean, he'll give interviews where, he favors innovation and he favors societies that encourage innovation, and he's worried about the retreat from innovation in the West. But in the end, he believes in the mission of the West, and so everything's going to be okay. And China's, sudden catching up now, which we'll say more about, like that. That ultimately is to do with the fact they finally overcome like their non-Westernness, and now they're headed in the right direction. All of that, which is what you'd expect. But I find more sympathetic what he'll also say, which is surely correct, which is that really there isn't a whole hell of a lot about the past that's terribly relevant to the current moment. I mean, he'll say this, that the radical nature of the present is such that the lessons that he's learned from the 18th century are just, is not that relevant. I mean, he'll say, I'm really not a great believer in the hypothesis that there's an awful lot we can learn from history about our own age, because our own age is so different in so many ways. Everything we see in the time I'm looking at is true, but multiplied 1,000 times over. Everything moves 1,000 times faster, 1,000 times cheaper. Yeah, it's a difference of degree, but the degree is so huge that it becomes a difference in kind. And like there, I think, speaks of wisdom about the relevance of 18th century economic history to the 21st century.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break right here, but we'll be back in a second to continue talking about this year's winners of the Nobel Prize for Economics. So let's shift then to Howitt and Aghion, the other two winners of the prize. Those two have worked together, and in fact, I believe we're sharing the prize for their work together. What was specifically called out was their work on innovation and creative destruction. And of course, those concepts reminded me of the episode that we did on this podcast on Schumpeter as a heterodox economist. And I'm curious if Howitt and Aghion, in sort of following that legacy of Schumpeter and in evoking creative destruction and the centrality of innovation to economic growth, if we should also be thinking of them as heterodox in some ways, or at least in the same ways as we discussed Schumpeter. I mean, it strikes me that, this emphasis on innovation and the contingency of innovation seems like it could oppose a more neoclassical or libertarian economic view of macroeconomics. But yeah, do Howitt and Aghion sort of fall then in a heterodox camp in some way?
Well, I mean, what's clear is that they've read some Schumpeter, and the model they're building is one in which innovation, technological change gets into the economy by way of competition between firms in imperfect markets. They try and build oligopolies, get monopolistic profit, beat other firms. And then all of that has a kind of Schumpeterian flavor to it, and that warrants this use of the term creative destruction. So it's by firm entry and firm exit that change happens at the technological level. But I mean, the crucial difference is that Schumpeter had a notion of capitalism. He came out of that late 19th century preoccupation with capitalism. Sombart, Schumpeter, Keynes, you could even say, come out of that tradition. And he had a rather dark historic, kind of tragic historic vision of where the world was headed. And that's completely unlike Aghion and Howitt. Like, that isn't a key part of their theorizing. Howitt's an interesting guy, has like a Keynesian background, but really they're starting from a completely different place. And in fact, the Nobel citation, there's two. It's really funny when, like, the Nobel Prize comes out, they do a thing for journalists with lots of pretty pictures that you can download, and then they have a science bit for people who want to know what these people wrote. And in Aghion and Howitt's case, it goes straight off the deep end, and like, you're struggling to make sense or tail of it right from the beginning, unless you've recently done a graduate degree in economics. But what they're trying to explain, and this is very clear from the Nobel citation, is the opposite of Schumpeter, namely the basics of modern growth are that it's relatively stable and continuous, and yet neoclassical economics starts from the premise that if you just apply more capital and more labor to the economic machine, in due course it runs into diminishing returns and then growth will stop. So not unlike Schumpeter, except that what we've witnessed is all the decades after World War II, which Schumpeter didn't get to witness. And in that period, growth really continued. It didn't level out the way that both Schumpeter and Keynes thought it would. And so Aghion and Howitt are using Schumpeterian mechanics to explain a totally non-Schumpeterian outcome, which is steady growth over time. And the way they describe this is as a kind of bowl, where if you have too little competition, very little innovation happens. And if you have too much competition, relatively little innovation happens, because there's not much incentive or much prospect of really building the kind of market advantage and moats that would allow you to reap the rewards for making the investment. And if, on the other hand, there's no competition, of course, there's no need to do this innovating. So the economy sits in a kind of narrow, sweet spot channel down the middle. And that essentially is, as it were, what they introduce to our theorizing is an understanding of why it is that innovation might proceed and proceed enough to produce continuous growth, but also doesn't produce like wild cycles, doesn't produce wild bursts of growth. It produces a steady flow of innovation, which we might want to shape and improve in one way or the other. But when it comes to that, they're very bland by comparison with the Schumpeter as this dark vision of the future. You know, their understanding you might really describe as something a little bit like social market economy, like, you know, a sensible government that stands at a sensible distance, that provides the right incentives will do the trick. So in the mechanics, it's Schumpeterian, because it's all about what firms do what innovation and how many firms enter and how many fail. But the story they're telling is a completely different one.
That's interesting. I mean, they seem to then take innovation for granted in some ways. This is a part of the system that isn't contingent. It will the fact that we're in this sweet spot. I guess No, I don't think they would argue that. They're actually the key contribution they're making is, so I mean, it's important to understand this. So neoclassical growth theory doesn't have a theory of innovation, but needs it to generate the observed reality of continuous growth. If you just took the analytics of the neoclassical model, it would predict growth up to a point and then steady state. So Solow in the 1950s, also a Nobel Prize winner, MIT god, like
basically built a model which required what's called exogenous technological change. And the game since the late 80s, 90s has been to endogenize technological change. And one way of doing that is a kind of general function where you basically describe a profit to be obtained by investing. This is what Paul Romer won the Nobel Prize for. What they do is go a step further, which is to link the process of innovation to the dynamics of competition within markets. So innovation doesn't just come in as a result of investing in producing patents. It comes in by new firms with new ideas entering into markets and innovating and displacing old firms. So it's like the third step in the neoclassical effort, not just to presume innovation as the thing which ultimately explains growth, but actually in some senses to analytically explain why it happens, why it continues to happen. But the observed reality is steadiness rather than, some apocalyptic, historic grand finale or flat out leveling out. Though in recent decades, one has to say that the growth rate has slowed down that much, that secular stagnation theory had a big comeback in the 2010s with Larry Summers. But their model is one that will explain ongoing technological change and give us some grip on the market, the underlying industrial economics. So linking up macro economics of growth with industrial economics is one of their big, formal contributions. If you think about the way in which the houses of economics are organized, they've bolted two of them together.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's useful because I suppose, and this may be wrong, but I thought of Schumpeter specifically as someone who thought of innovation almost as exogenous. I mean, precisely not endogenous, almost like as acts of like genius, and entrepreneurial genius that were kind of like producing this innovation. But again, that's just sort of my own sketch that I had in my head when it came to Schumpeter's views. But then to look more specifically at Aghion, I wanted to ask about Aghion's relationship to climate policy, because he seems to have applied his views on innovation and creative destruction that we've been talking about to thinking about climate change and climate policy. And I'm curious how his views differ from the views of, other climate economists like William Nordhaus, say.
Yeah, also a Nobel Prize winner, somebody I think we did talk about on the show as well. This is where what we've just said is we're going to have a payoff, right? Because in Nordhaus's model of the climate, basically, it's a completely standard neoclassical model of the climate with one unaccounted for externality, which is the climate problem. And so to fix that climate problem, what you need is a price for carbon. And the price for carbon takes care of the externality and makes everything right as rain. The implicit idea in Nordhaus as well is that if you fix the price right, in due course, technological change will come along and will allow you to shift. But that is purely exogenous. It's just something that will happen as a result of the price being set right and carbon being priced properly. What Aghion and Acemoglu, actually in a paper they co-wrote with other authors as well, lay out is that this understates the nature of the problem, and technology is key. Because there are, in fact, two market failure problems. One is that you haven't priced the externality of climate, and for that you need a carbon price. And the other problem is that technology is path dependent. And so if you invest in fossil, what happens is you go down a fossil route, and fossil technologies will then appear more profitable as a result of the stock of accumulated fossil knowledge. It's easier to make gains there. And so you will be tempted to go on investing on the fossil route and on the fossil technology route, and you will underinvest systematically on the carbon side, on the clean side, and that will make it progressively harder and harder and harder to make the switch. And so then the price adjustment you're going to need is going to be more and more brutal. And what they say is, no. The way we escape this is we have a two-pronged climate policy. We have a carbon pricing policy, and we have a clean energy technology subsidy policy. And the clean energy technology subsidy policy will allow us to shift this balance and open up a track for rapid development on the clean side. And that then will really hugely change the dynamic of climate policy, because whereas Nordhaus famously argued to slow climate policy down because the costs by pricing were so high, If you're doing the technology route, it's all the other way around. The key thing to do is to pump money in now to change the underlying profile of the technological map so that we can then make rapid progress down this other track. So this theory, I think you really see its payoffs when you think about this question of directed technological change and its applications to cases like this, because it becomes a bona fide justification for the new green industrial policy. And it also has very interesting implications for international policy, because in the Nordhaus model, because basically you are just fixing the externality for everyone with a carbon price, everyone has an incentive to free ride on you. If, on the other hand, you're doing this technological innovation policy, then the benefits that you generate by investing pay for themselves. And furthermore, they then open up the space for other people to get in on the act as well and to reduce their own costs. So rather than it being a kind of negative sum game, where if I make a carbon policy move, it reduces the incentive for other people to do green energy moves. If you follow their logic, the more one country invests in technological improvements on the clean energy side, the more it becomes attractive for other people to do it too. And for competitive reasons, but also because the stock of knowledge is expanding. And so we all get payoffs from the externalities generated by the patents, the basic research, and so on. So it's really this is where the rubber hits the road. This for me was the moment where I thought, okay, I get it. Like this is really not just, deeply clever, but it's also mapping very nicely the trend of thinking in the current moment in relation to a really fundamental problem.
Yeah, I want to clarify one thing, because it sounds like you're saying that this is an argument for industrial policy, clearly, but industrial policy in this sense then isn't just supporting a new technology. Part of the point is it's opposing the existing technologies.
Yeah. It's shifting it's saying that this landscape is not neutral, right? It goes back to this point of does this simply presume technology? No, what it's saying is technology is the effect of accumulative investments, and this will then generate coalitions that seek to resist. There is going to be a bloody struggle here. This is where the creative destruction element comes back. And so absolutely, industrial policy is about shifting the gradient on which future choices are going to be made, the terrain on which future choices are going to be made.
I mean, the other question that this raises for me is this an argument in some ways against carbon taxes? In the sense that then, if what's needed is innovation and technological innovation, is carbon taxes, is increasing taxes on the potential, on capital itself, a kind of step in the wrong direction? I don't know if that would be part of what how Aghion would see matters.
No, it's not. It's not an argument against carbon taxation. It's a reprioritization. So for Nordhaus, there's only one optimal policy. You have one problem, you have one instrument, and the carbon taxation is the optimal one. He prefers taxation even to cap and trade. What they're saying is we've actually got two problems. We've got a bias in fossil fuel investment in technologies, which creates externalities which aren't being priced in, and we have the climate problem as well, and we need to act on both. And if we lead fast and heavy on the technology side, and then follow up with the price incentives, the effect of the price incentives will be larger and they will be less expensive. Because the nightmare of the price first is you basically just use the price weapon to torture people into changing their technological tack, right? Which is a nightmare. And so Nordhaus concludes, well, we can't do that. We're going to have to postpone this. We should put this off for as long as possible, and basically becomes an apologist for 3-degree warming. Whereas what they're saying is, no. If we proactively move fast on the technology side, we open up paths which we then continue to push down with carbon pricing. It's a false choice. You've got two problems. You need two instruments. Both work, but it's a sequencing thing, and it's a scale thing, and it's a timing thing. And that's what they're offering, a very sophisticated rationale for a broader toolkit.
So I'm curious now, if we were to take the work of the winners, all three of the winners together, what conclusions we could draw with their sort of emphasis on innovation, creative destruction that we were just talking about. Generally, the need for a culture of innovation that we were talking about in the case of Mokyr as well. I mean, do these winners together expose the problems that today Europe faces? I'm thinking of Europe as a place that has a lot of advantages. There's plenty of research, a knowledge base, financial resources, money. But even though you sort of described Mokyr as saying, the West had this advantage when it came to a culture of innovation, is that in fact not the case today when it comes to Europe? Are there sort of cultural obstacles that are standing in Europe's way when it comes to growth and innovation?
I mean, we don't have to speculate about that because Aghion, along with Jean Tirole, who another great French industrial economist, also a Nobel Prize winner, has been very vocal in support, essentially, of the Mario Draghi agenda from 2024. So basically, they argue that there is a serious innovation problem in Europe. But just following on the logic of what we were just saying about climate policy, it's not about culture and it's not about basic research. Europe used to lag the US in terms of public funding of basic research, but has in fact largely closed that gap. The big difference is in private investment in R&D in Europe, which is about half the level of the US. And that is largely explicable in terms of Aghion and Howitt's kind of logic, which is that it is incumbent players in boring old industries that don't reward dramatic investments in new R&D. And if there's a culture issue, it's a culture of underinvestment in those sectors. But they're the people that generated that astonishing table in the Draghi report from 24, which basically showed you that 20 years ago, the 5 largest R&D investors in Europe were basically all in the automotive sector, and 4 of them were German. And 20 years later, the same thing is true, and it's the same names in a slightly different order. And when you compare that with the United States or China, where we've seen a complete transformation in the R&D landscape in the private sector, you have your answer as to why there is this productivity and failure in Europe, which is it's a sectoral problem. And then within that, a corporate strategy problem. And it's very serious, therefore, and structural, and clearly requires government intervention to try and change the landscape. There are notable exceptions like aerospace, like Airbus, but overall, it's a structural kind of account rather than a cultural account, and it's pretty damning.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that brings me back to our discussion of Mokyr, because to the extent I understood his argument, it was precisely that in the Industrial Revolution, it wasn't just a matter of having basic research in place. There was a way of translating that into actual innovations. There were institutions that seemed to translate this knowledge into economic innovations. And clearly something is missing today in Europe along those lines. But I guess maybe to end off with, I wonder whether any of these thinkers who just won this award this year, if they reckon with or explain the innovations and growth of China right now. I do know that Mokyr has a new forthcoming book that's looking at Europe and China in some comparative fashion. The book is not yet out. I haven't managed to get my hands on it, but I'm not sure if he does an attempt at explaining China's successes. But do you know whether they managed to in any of their work?
So, I mean, Aghion is pretty straightforward. They've done studies of Chinese industrial policy, and it works for all the reasons that we think it works. It's one of the demonstrations of the fact that a determined shove in the right direction can change the direction of R&D very considerably. And they include China in their studies of automotive investment. So that's fairly normal science, to be honest, and it makes sense. Mokyr's a stranger case. So he has this book coming out with Greif and another co-author, which is a West and China comparison of the last millennium. It starts in 1000 and it goes to hand-waving 2000. And the basic story is the story that, it's a big, complicated book, but the basic idea is fragmentation of political power in Europe goes hand in hand with a social space and a civil society organized around the free association of individuals in entities they call corporations. Whereas in China, a dynastic, hierarchical, autocratic power structure goes hand in hand with a civil society from the Song dynasty onwards, organized principally around what they call clan logic. And that explains the fundamental difference. And then communism happens, and in Mokyr's words, that's even worse. And then the but on there, and then they cite various kinds of studies of the Mao period. Maoism didn't manage to break the familialism of Chinese society, and the resurgence of growth from the 1980s onwards is a relatively happy synthesis of increasingly modernized institutions with Chinese familialism. And hey presto, that's your story. And I don't know. It's hard to take it seriously as an account of modern China. It literally just hand waves the last 100 years. I mean, there's a series of working papers. So the book's not out yet, but I've read a bunch of working papers that led up to it, and they're so grotesquely chronologically imprecise that it's really hard to quite know what their 20th century story is going to be. Because as Mokyr himself admits, things kind of get speedier in the 20th century and even more in the 21st century. So, like, time slicing by the quarter millennium is not really going to do you much good in trying to understand what's happening in China. You're not going to understand human capital formation unless you do take the communist period seriously, in which people learn to read, got basic healthcare, basic infrastructure was set up. I'm not eagerly looking forward to this as a hugely illuminating account of modern China.
Is he acknowledging China's rise? I mean, it seems like that the question is the premise.
It's present, but it's not. And it's interesting, as Asimov and Robinson were frank enough to say, like, we really have a problem and China's our big problem. In this case, it's there, but the theory itself is so kind of floppy, really, that in the end, it's hard to see that necessarily China's surge presents a serious obstacle. This is one of the moments where you kind of think, is this for real? And the Aghion Howitt thing is of a completely different quality. Like, every single piece they published, you have a very clear idea of like what the hit is, what the technical contribution is. I mean, it's of a work of a very, very high order, and making, as we have been saying, like very clear contributions to highly sophisticated literatures, bolting them in absolutely at the cutting edge of what people are doing, and with really dramatic and immediate policy payoffs for areas of policy which are highly dynamic.
Well, again, it's all three of them that managed to win the prize, although obviously their work differs in some important ways. Yeah, I guess we'll leave the conversation off here, but I think it's safe to say that we'll be covering next year's winners around this time. But for now, we will say goodbye and be back, as always, next week. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by Adam and me and produced by Claudia Tatey. The show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers and Ones and Tooze listeners. As always, we love getting listener feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com or email us. That's podcast@foreignpolicy.com. Or you can tweet us. That's @onesandtwospod. I'm Cameron Abadi. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.